Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us for today's Local Government Education webinar series program brought to you by the University of Illinois Extension in cooperation with Rural Partners, an Illinois rural development organization. My name is Mike Delaney, and I'm an Extension Community and Economic Development educator based up here in Ogle County in Northwestern Illinois. Today's webinar, as you undoubtedly know, is Downtown Restoration Part 2. We'll begin with a few quick housekeeping notes. First off, we are, as I mentioned, recording today's webinar. At the conclusion of today's presentation, anybody who's registered for the presentation is going to receive an email with the materials from the presentation and access to the recording of the webinar. If you're here but didn't register in advance for the webinar, that's totally okay. If you'd like to receive these materials, please drop your email into the chat box to let us know. We'll add you to the list so that you'll get those materials after the conclusion of the presentation. As always, if you have questions or comments, please use the chat space. We'll be reviewing the questions in a Q&A period following the presentation. Now, I'd like to introduce Ann Silvas. Ann is the Assistant Dean for Community and Economic Development with University of Illinois Extension. She's also a member of the board of Rural Partners. Ann, take it away.
Thanks, Mike. And I echo Mike's welcome, and it's great to be here. I guess I can wear both my hats today, University of Illinois Extension, and I serve on the board of the Illinois Rural Development Council, Rural Partners. So in cooperation, these two groups work together to identify issues that are important across the state and then bring you these webinars. So it's great to be here. It's great that these organizations are working together to bring you topics of interest. And in fact, if you have issues that you'd like us to address in future webinars, we'll be glad to take that information. One more thing, University of Illinois Extension is engaged in a strategic planning process. So I'm going to put a link in the chat space, and you can click on that link and then go there later if you want to answer questions for our survey. That's going to be very helpful to us as we develop our strategic plan for University of Illinois Extension. So thanks to everyone for being here, and we're looking forward to a great webinar.
Thanks, Ann. And now we're going to go to the main program. I'd like to introduce Quinn Adamowski. Quinn is here representing Landmarks Illinois as its regional advocacy manager. He serves as the organization's frontline preservation advocate throughout Illinois. Quinn, the stage is yours.
Okay, well, thank you for having me. Thank you, University of Illinois Extension and Rural Partners. Excited to be here for part 2 of this webinar series. Lot to cover today. So first, I just want to go through real quick what we talked about last time. On May 16th, we talked about the National Register of Historic Places as an economic development tool, potential tool for downtown redevelopment, what it means to be on the register, and probably more importantly, what it does not mean. I believe that historic preservation is an economic development tool. So I wanted to sort of lay the groundwork for a discussion around today. I will give a brief introduction about my organization at the front, just so you have a clear understanding of who we are. I did that last time, so I'll do a truncated version this time, assuming that many of the people who are on here today were on the last time. And then so today I will sort of go through dealing with bad owners and building orders, which we all know what those are, and then sort of run into the setting the stage for investment into your community. And I wanted to pivot this way based on the feedback I received from the last webinar and a lot of the questions that I had. So then I will cover some incentives, tools, programs, many of which may be familiar with you, maybe some of them are not. And of course, that's not going to be an all-inclusive package that I'll cover, but it's enough to sort of show what's possible, right? And then I'll end with a few case studies and examples that are in process or already concluded throughout the state. And there are, of course, numerous stories that I could have picked, but I felt that the ones I'm going to cover today were a good cross-section in terms of population, in terms of some of the programs that have been implemented. And I have, some intimate familiarity with or my organization does. So I felt like the ones that I'm going to cover today make a lot of sense and should be attributable to those of you across the state. So with that, I'll just jump in real quick. My organization, we are a nonprofit. We have a statewide historic preservation nonprofit in Illinois. We were founded in 1971. We are based in Chicago, but over the past 25 years, we made a concerted effort to become more of a statewide organization. And as Mike referenced, my title is Regional Advocacy Manager. That effectively means that I have the territory of Galena down to Cairo, basically all of Illinois outside of the Collier counties. So who we are people saving places for people. This is our mission statement. We're here to help preserve, protect, and promote architectural and historic resources through advocacy and education. And of course, this webinar would fall under the latter. People value places. The past is vital to the future. We do not, as an organization, feel it's important or correct to impose preservation on communities. We believe that communities need to define preservation for themselves. We're here to help them do that. So what do? We provide wraparound services on preservation, advocacy, and technical assistance. We work on public policy and legislation. We recently had a pretty big win down in Springfield, which I'll reference a little bit later on. We do have some small grant resources for seed grants that a lot of organizations have used to leverage to get larger grants. We have surveys and databases available on our webpage to provide a whole host of information. We have a resource directory, so if you are looking for firms that do preservation work or preservation adjacent work for that matter, we do have a resource directory available on our website. And we have two large programs throughout the year. The Most Endangered Historic Places list. That actually happened on May 4th of this year. And that's to highlight key historic resources that are in peril in one way, shape, or form. And then we have a celebratory program called the Richard H. Driehaus Foundation Preservation Awards, and those generally take place in October. And those are meant to highlight wonderful preservation projects throughout the state. And of course, we do more. So that is my organization briefly. I'm happy to answer any questions about what else we do at the conclusion of the webinar. So again, just what is historic preservation, right? That's the idea that we just want to save old stuff. And that there is some truth to that. We do want to save old stuff. But really, it's about conserving and protecting historic resources that are significant to our personal or shared stories. So whether that be at a personal level, at a community level, our role is to save places that matter to people. If the places that matter to you, we're probably not going to step in to do much of anything with it. And of course, we're all very familiar with landmarks, landmark status. And as I went through at length the last webinar, the local and national. And for the purpose of this webinar, really, whenever I refer to landmark, it's going to be about the National Register. And I would argue that historic preservation is the intersection of arts, entertainment, environment, sociology, anthropology, tourism, all these things wrapped into one, because we do a lot through storytelling. And of course, preservation is adaptive reuse. And with adaptive reuse, I would argue that it's a wonderful economic development tool and can be catalytic for communities across the state. So that sets up what the idea of preservation is, right? So how does preservation fit into downtown redevelopment? How do these old buildings that seemingly don't have answers, how can we look at them as tools for economic development rather than that thing that sits off side of the square that nobody knows what to do with and is falling apart, and it's creating a dilapidated state. So let's talk about bad owners. Bad owners, right? Bad owners are a problem for everyone. Smaller communities through larger communities. And oftentimes they're bad owners because they have a lack of capacity, they have lack of vision, and or they don't have the resources. And oftentimes because of those things, they don't invest in their properties, and the properties become in a dilapidated state. We also know that bad owners take on bad bad businesses because the attitude is any rent is better than no rent. We all know that that's not the case, because if you get a bad owner, a tenant in there that's not generating revenues, it's not generating interest, and then they default and they're sort of just sitting there, and a good owner sometimes doesn't know what to do with them. Oftentimes we know that bad owners are bad owners because they have buildings that are not for sale. And we often hear that they are holding out for a turnaround, that they are sitting on a gold mine. When the reality is, more often than not, they're building things that are preventing a turnaround. And with all this, we have no owner property maintenance. So we have these dilapidated structures that sit there for years, perhaps decades, under threat, public safety that the city is going to have to deal with, and eventually they become a threat to adjacent owners who may have good buildings, but they share a wall with a bad owner. And now we're talking about roof leaks, and we're getting behind their wall, and then we have a cascade effect where even with a good owner, they have to invest thousands of dollars into their building to prevent it from falling down because of a bad owner. And then we have the idea of owner neglect, financial duties, right? So we have a failure to pay taxes and or more for a variety of different reasons. And now we're looking at a lien and default imposed limbo where nobody's really sure what to do or what can be done. And again, the property just continues to languish. So because of the actions or inactions of bad owners, we end up with vacancy. And that suggests to tourists, visitors, or even people who live in town that no one cares or wants to invest in our communities. It's a lost opportunity for tax revenues because of the building sitting vacant. It's not generating business. It's not generating revenues. It's not generating tax revenues for the city. And there's a loss of opportunity to encourage investment. So if I am a tourist that comes in and I'm looking through here, I see a bunch of vacancies. Why do I want to invest in this community that seemingly nobody else wants to invest in? And of course, we do have eventual demo. If a building sits there dilapidated for years, if there's no money put into it, or roofs are not taken care of, or the envelope is not taken care of, someone's going to have to demo it eventually, and more often than not, it's going to be the municipality that is going to have to put the bill for that. And demo equates to a loss of historic resources. So we should look at these older buildings as resources for development. And every time that one comes down, we're taking it offline and we don't have the opportunity for private investment. We're creating empty holes. When we use parking lots, oftentimes at corners. That's not good for anyone. It portrays a lack of interest and opportunity, much the same way that vacancy does. Unlike vacancy, you can't unthrow away a building, right? You can't demo something and have it come back. So demo is obviously the worst case scenario, and a lot of what we're trying to do collectively, whether it be preservationists, economic development folks, city planners, whomever, is to try to preserve what we have for the purposes of redevelopment. And this all leads to a common cycle of, disinvestment and loss. So I put on here, it's bad owners, equates to a lack of investment, equals more costly renovations, and because those renovations are costly, they're probably not going to do those, so that's going to result in even more likely vacancy, which equates to even less investment, which then results in dilapidation and eventually demo. And so this is a cycle that we can see throughout the state and every community across the state. And as I mentioned, eventually the city is going to have to act. One of the city's responsibilities is to ensure public safety. If we have a building that's falling down on top of Main Street, the city has to do something. And so oftentimes the cities will do some of the things I'm going to suggest a little bit later on, but they do it too late. And they do it too late for a variety of different reasons. But at the end of the day, once they have the opportunity to demo for public safety, they do, and all of this, of course, is a costing an investment of time and financial resource for the city in regards to staff time, perhaps legal action, demo costs, etc. So what are some proactive measures, right? So the city has reacted to the situation of a bad owner, but I would argue the city could have acted proactively, right? Either way, proactive or reactive, public resources will be expended. So the question is, does a municipality want to spend resources up front, or do they want to spend them on the back end? And of course, the benefit of spending them up front is there's a greater potential to see a historic resource come back online, just by way of saving it, by way of promoting investment in it. Whereas a reactive eventual involvement of the municipality is more than likely to lead to demo and loss of historic resource. So here are some basic things that I think municipalities can do, and I did not cook these up. This is coming through research, through discussion with other people across the state. Some of these are easier than others, but I figured it's only fair to include all the things. So first up is code enforcement and follow-through. And I would say that you need to be aggressive and unrelenting. It's one thing to send a letter, say, hey, we really need you to do this. It's another thing to send a letter, certified letter, laying out the steps that the municipality is going to take if these things are not addressed. If you want things in writing for potentially later things that I'm going to suggest. And impose the fines. And maybe they don't pay the fines. Okay, but impose them anyway. That way you have a track record that you are indeed trying to do something about this. And now, in addition to potential issues with mortgage, potential issues on taxes not being paid, now you also have the position of fines not being paid. And I would ask this question because I know oftentimes it's hard to go after people who live in our own communities, right? Like even those what we call bad building owners, more often than not live in our communities. And of course, we are always trying to do our best to be good neighbors. But I would ask is, should the rights of a bad property owner supersede those of good property owners? It may be hard to, be aggressive, impose fines on our friends. But is it worse to let our friends who have bad buildings create a situation where a bad roof leaks into another building owner's building, or where their bad property, their vacant property results in people not being so interested in coming to our downtowns? Good owners should be rewarded. They should be incentivized and they should be protected at all costs, either from bad building owners or bad businesses. Another thing that the city and the municipality can do is act as a building owner. If the owner does not have interest in selling the property, does not have interest in seeking a tenant, or just doesn't have the capacity or the wherewithal, the city can do that. Identify the needs of your community, identify the buildings which those needs could reside, and explore and find businesses and tenants and bring them to your downtown, invite them here and show them the buildings that might be available and introduce them to the owners. Do what you can to promote the sale of a building if that's the best course of action. Recruiting new owners, it falls along the same lines. There are people who go into smaller communities on a regular basis for tourist purposes, and lo and behold, they eventually fall in love with the municipality, and they really like that downtown, and they want to buy a building, and they figure out a way to do that, and they do, and they start with a business. So make it very obvious that your community is interested in finding new owners, finding new businesses. Make it very apparently open for business. So that's what you're going to do, is encourage new ownership. And you can also do that by removing and reducing red tape barriers on transaction costs. Make it easy for people to want to invest in your community, to invest in properties in your community. And you can ease and facilitate processes. Of course, we know that a lot of smaller communities don't have city planners, so we need to figure out ways around that. And if we have more simple processes and we're working with regional partners to facilitate a lot of that, then it's more likely that people are going to want to come and invest because it's easy to do. Some other things that we can look at are land banks. Land banks, of course, are pretty prevalent throughout the state of Illinois, but they probably could even be more so. And the whole purpose here would be to acquire, secure, and stabilize buildings. Of course, we can use land banks in different ways, but for the purpose of this webinar, to discuss bad owners and bad buildings that are in disrepair, if we can find some dollars to put into the bank, we can acquire the property And then we're able to secure that property and stabilize that property and sell that property. Once it's stabilized and secure, then we can take those revenues and then we keep repeating the cycle. And then we can take a little bit more drastic measures, right? Secure the building title. So here are 3 ways that that can be done. Of course, this is sort of in a lot of ways, a nuclear option, so to speak. You can use eminent domain if it's definitely a public safety issue. That's a very long and hard process. It can be costly, but if it's necessary, then perhaps that's a thing that you pursue. The issue with eminent domain, there's a lot of issues with it, of course, but the big issue is public use dilemma, wherein if you do use that, then it's really hard to do anything with the property, especially if you have to, go through the demolition process, because what is a public use and what a commercial building look like? Of course, there's tax delinquency. If they're not paying, we can issue a lien. Again, this is sort of a takeover measure potentially, but of course we have to be prepared for an auction. If you issue a lien, if they're unable to pay the taxes and this thing goes to auction, the municipality is going to have to be ready to try to pay for it. In the event that there is somebody who comes along that does want to invest in that property, that does want to become a building holder. Sometimes these properties can go for cheap, oftentimes they don't. And so if you're going to go through the lien process, I would strongly suggest that you have the resources available to put it in a bid at auction. And of course, there's court order transfer. There are communities across the state that are doing this right now. Oftentimes it's under the auspices of public safety. So you have a building, the bricks are crumbling, it's falling into the alley, it's falling into a thoroughfare, it's making the sidewalk unsafe. And this is where you get lawyers involved and you get in front of a judge and you make the case that the building owner has not done what he or she is supposed to do. And this goes back to what I mentioned earlier about imposing fines. So you have this track record, you have this paperwork showing that you've exhausted all the other avenues that you have through the ordinances. And this is the last step that you can come up with as a municipality to protect your residents and other building owners from buildings that are in disrepair. So those are some of the things that you can do, just sort of on a daily basis, or come up with, strategic ways to do. And then there are the larger questions about creating favorable market conditions, right? And so what I just covered prior to that are very direct ways to address bad ownership, or to encourage the sale of buildings of bad owners, right? But if we create favorable market conditions, if we have structural and systemic investments by the municipalities, there is the opportunity then to encourage the sale of the building, or perhaps even encourage development of the building and turn a bad owner into a good owner. And one of the other ways of doing that is through, tourism, or providing experiences, creating foot traffic. And I would just point to the picture on the right, that is downtown Utica. This is called the Mill Street Patio. This is something that started around the pandemic and will continue through this year, in fact. And this is an example of tactical urbanism. If you're not familiar with the idea of tactical urbanism, also referred to as guerrilla urbanism or pop-up urbanism. And it's the idea of taking low-cost temporary changes to the built environment. In this case, in Utica, on the main drag, and putting basically a pop-up bar, cafeteria, to promote foot traffic, promote people coming in across the state, and people do. In fact, visit Utica regularly on the weekends now, and it's been a big economic development driver for their downtown. The structural and systemic changes initiatives, right? So what can the city do? What can the city invest in? What kind of actions should the city take to set the stage for investment? What are the tools that we need to have ourselves? Infrastructure. So make sure that, if you can get the funds to address your sewers, your water mains, streets, sidewalks, take care of the basics so that when people do come into the community, they see vibrancy. They're like, yes, I want to invest here. Form a downtown committee and commission. This is especially true if you don't have a large city staff, you don't have planning staff. You need to rely on the people who live there, the people who, business owners specifically, to have these conversations, to envision what our downtowns could look like. And that could lead to a downtown plan, right? So like, who are we? What do we have? What are our resources? What can we do? How do we encourage people to come here? And then for cities a little bit larger, we could talk about a comprehensive plan and how downtown revitalization might fit into that. And as last webinar, I covered the National Register Historic District. If you don't want to go that far, you can do something along the lines of the Historic Resources Survey, which is not as intensive, but it will give you an understanding of what kind of buildings you have, what their historical use was, what they could be used for, just general information. That way, when you are looking at what do we need, what could we have, you at least have some basic information. And with National Register districts and or resource surveys have design guidelines. It doesn't have to necessarily be hard and fast rules. You can do that through your ordinances if you would like, but at least have the option for people to understand what historic design guidelines look like. Promote those, encourage owners to do that. That way there is some consistency, and the fabric of downtown seems to make more sense from a historic perspective. And of course, then there's market studies and feasibility studies. These can be, a little intensive, or they can be very intensive. A market study to figure out what you have, or what people might be interested in doing, or what's viable business options for you. If you know that, then you know who to approach. You know what business to ask to come. You know how you're going to sell your city. And then of course, feasibility studies fall more in the line of, okay, we have this idea, but will it really work here? And then there are, of course, firms that do a lot of this work, consultancy that you could hire to help you along that line. Now, I will point out the last part of the slides called Placer AI. I have some familiarity with it. I would just suggest that you do use it because it's real-time data based on cell phone movement. So as people go to your downtown, the Placer AI is able to gather information to determine where they came from, where they're most likely headed next, where they were at even earlier in the day. And so you have a better understanding of who's coming into your town. It's way less intrusive and way less time intensive, obviously, than market study or feasibility study. And it could be a quick way to gain a better understanding of what you have to work with, which could inform the direction you go with a market study or feasibility study. Again, this is a private entity. I would encourage you to reach out to them. I'm sure that there are others that just happens to be one I'm familiar with. And it seems to me with the limited interaction I've had with it, it could be very helpful in at least providing some guidance. What else can we do to set the stage? One of the things is always to look through the lens of how do we leverage our community hook? What is our hook? Each community has something, whether it's an old prison, in my case, in the city of Joliet, or whether it's perhaps Route 66, as is the case of Pontiac. There's always going to be something. Maybe it's a state park, a national park, a haunted cemetery, whatever the case might be. What do you have that may draw people to your location? How do you make the cultural assets and attractions monetizable? And this all falls under the idea of heritage tourism. And with heritage tourism, we're leveraging what we already had. We're not creating new, we're just taking what we have and we're really showcasing, we're really making it of interest to people. We're creating experiences around that. And so by leveraging our community hooks, we're drawing in more people, especially with tourism. People are spending money there, but they're not necessarily putting a toll on our resources, right? So they're not necessarily having a large impact on our roads. They're in and out, but we're capturing tax dollars. And another thing is local wealth and or capacity. There are folks who live in smaller towns, just like they do in larger towns, that have monies. And if you can work with them or show them a path to invest in their communities, maybe that's another source of revenue to use. And oftentimes, even if you don't have money, People have the brain power, they have the ability, but we oftentimes just don't ask. Would you like to help? Can you help? And so I would encourage you to look at those as well. I mentioned before the State Historic Preservation Office, there's a program called Upstairs Downtown. I would look at that because priorities in second story residential in your downtowns makes a whole lot of sense. And the last thing here is the arts. We oftentimes overlook the arts. Nonprofit organizations, especially arts-related organizations, form a city commission and a committee based around the arts. Maybe you end up with a mural program that becomes catalytic. Let's look at our other cultural institutions, our museums, our libraries. These are all folks who who are invested in their communities, and while they're not "quote unquote" economic development experts, everything they do is adjacent to that and can have a large impact on what you do with your downtown. So what are some incentives, tools, and programs? So we've set the stage, and now we're looking at potential options for investment. We talked about the National Register Historic District last time with tax credits. I'm not going to cover that. And again, I'm sure that a lot of you are familiar with a lot of these. I'm going to go through these quickly. We have the tax increment financing district. We have a special service area. You can read through these. I like the special service area a lot because there's a lot you can do with those dollars. And rather than hope that there's new tax revenues based on the TIF, this is just a direct property tax collected so that you have the dollars and you can do more with it faster. And then there's business development and redevelopment district. So this is a special additional retail tax and hotel tax up to 1% in quarter increments. And again, I understand that people don't like the idea of taxing, but sometimes it makes sense for communities to do that. If you can get a little seed money, make some improvements to your downtown through a TIF, through an SSA, through a BDD, and all of a sudden, hey, look, the city's investing some dollars, I'm going to invest some dollars, which creates more tax revenues, which creates more interest, and it's sort of a snowball effect. So the larger programs that are out there, New Markets tax credits, and to your right, you can see this is a map. The red and the yellow are areas where New Market tax credits are a thing, can be a thing. So that we see that this could be utilized in Southern Illinois in a very large way. This is extremely complicated, of course, and you do need the CDIF. I would definitely reach out to a community development entity or the CDIF to better understand how this works. But effectively what happens is private capital goes to a CDE, and then that is given by way of loan to qualified businesses in a low-income community. And then the benefit, of course, for private capital is they receive tax credits in exchange for their equity. Low-income housing tax credit. Of course, there's a need for housing across the state. Maybe not necessarily for the exact commercial corridor of downtown, but perhaps it's an adjacent building or just outside. Old schools oftentimes make a lot of sense for this. But the idea is if you create housing, you create demand, which creates more interest and more need in the downtown redevelopment plan. So low-income housing tax credits are effectively a tax incentive to construct or rehabilitate affordable renting housing for low-income households. This is not the same thing as public housing. These are private-owned rental units that are developed because the credits make it subsidize the cost for the developer. And so, they're the same thing as you would get anywhere else. It's just that they're more affordable rental units. And there's an incentive for developers to develop because of less cost to do so. And I mentioned this the last webinar, Community Development Block Grant, federal funding through HUD. Most of you on the webinar today are not going to be entitlement communities of 50,000 or more, obviously. And so you have to apply to the state. And I looked up earlier today, and a little over $30 million the state receives in CDBG funds that are available for communities to apply for. And a lot of what I discussed today in terms of, doing studies, trying to better understand things, national register, all these things could be paid for through CDBG grants. There's Illinois Enterprise Zones Program. These are state and local tax incentives. There's credits, abatements, exemptions, sales tax deductions, and as you can see to the right, These are the current zones available in Illinois. There's an arduous application process that communities can go through. And all of this, of course, is available on the DCO webpage. And then there's opportunity zones. This is a federal program that started off in 2017. There's still a little bit of confusion around how these work, but effectively, if an area is considered economically distressed and it needs investment revitalization, investors with tax liabilities, specifically capital gains liabilities, can defer those or reduce them by putting money into an opportunity fund. And an opportunity fund is then used to help invest in local areas that need investment. Some other incentives, tools, programs, revolving loan fund, hotel motel tax. Make sure that you have a hotel motel tax, make sure that you're maxing it out and ask the question, what are we doing with it if we do have it? Are we putting it into general revenues? Are we earmarking it for the purposes of tourism, promoting tourism, redevelopment, etc.? And then of course there's tax abatement, which isn't always the best approach, but it's the approach you can use, then I would suggest at least explore it. Facade programs, a lot of those can be, you can use SSA dollars, TIP monies in the facade program, again, to promote building owners to do the right thing. And then one year that's no cost, canvassing. Go door to door, talk to your land, talk to the owners, find out what it is that they want, find out what their challenges are, and encourage them to, continue in conversation. And eventually maybe you form a downtown committee if you don't already have one. So those are, and I know I'm going through this very quickly. Those are incentives, tools, and programs I think should be explored. Of course, there are others. And with all that, I'm now going to talk about some communities that have done some of these things, success stories. And I'm not an expert in their communities, right? I've had interaction with them, I've done research, I've talked with folks on the ground who've done this work. And what I do know is that the communities I'm about to discuss, they're happy to talk about what they've done. They're proud of what they've done. And I would encourage you to reach out to them, to find out more about their story, to find out if it's applicable to your situation. So first up, I'm going to start with Jacksonville, a population of 17,500. The pictures here you see in the top left, this is what their town square looked like not too long ago. And I'll talk a little bit about how that happened. And then to the bottom right, that's what it more or less looks like today. And as you can see, the town square to the top left was completely cut off from the traffic. At best, you're going to get some foot traffic, but who really wants to walk through that, right? And on the right, you can see now they have a path for pedestrians, you have a path for vehicular traffic, and you have parking all around the area. So why am I picking Jacksonville? I would argue that Jacksonville is a quintessential case. Based on what I talked with them about, based on what I've read, this has happened in every single community, it seems like. There was a thriving downtown at one time. And then, of course, urban renewal comes in, the idea that malls come in. And so in the 70s, our communities decided to just do the wrong thing, which was leave our downtowns and go to the mall. And so then we end up with closed streets. In the case of Jacksonville, they raised 60 historic structures during all this period. They put in new, improved buildings. As you can see here in this picture, they made 4 of these buildings in the middle of their square that sort of just didn't make any sense. They put in street canopies to encourage pedestrian traffic, when in fact it did the exact opposite. And so there's no foot traffic, there's no vehicular traffic, there's no businesses there because they've gone to downtown. The ones that are there, they don't have anybody coming to. So you have this languishing downtown with these amazing historic resources. And so you have an empty downtown with alarming vacancy. And so Jacksonville struggled over the years. And then, late 90s, early 2000s rolls around. And then they start working towards a collaborative rebirth. And a lot of the credit here goes to Jacksonville Main Street. And I know that there's a webinar on Illinois Main Street coming up. And I'm sure that, the Main Street approach will be discussed at that webinar. But a lot of what happened in Jacksonville is based around those strategies. So Jacksonville Main Street is a downtown focused organization. They use a Main Street approach, Main Street America approach, even today outside of this. This is an ongoing effort, by the way. And you had a forward-thinking government in Jacksonville who saw the need, who saw the vision of downtown of what it could be. Right? We have these resources, we have promise, we have to figure something out. What we have is not good enough. So let's take some chances, let's do some things. And the government, along with Jacksonville Main Street, leveraged the local human capital, brought partners together, and had a collaborative Main Street approach. And what they did was they created a plan with actionable wins, right? So rather than just go after everything at one time, identify what the needs are, identify strategies to approach those needs, and identify ways, strategies, to fulfill the hope that you have to get beyond what you were currently working with. And just a few of the things that they started a facade program. So we're going to encourage businesses to update, upgrade what they have. Businesses throw in a little bit of money, facade program throws in a little bit of money too. They focus in on upper story development. That way we have residential down there. Now we're creating demand inside the square. There were grants that they applied for, both the city and Main Street being a nonprofit, city being a governmental entity. It opens up all the different grant possibilities. And I imagine they probably co-authored grants as well, again, towards facade improvements, towards tourism, towards infrastructure, redevelopment, development. They have a TIF district. They recruited small retailers to come in. And you have this, again, this effect, the snowball effect. And then as you have more businesses here, as you have upper story development taking place, now you're using TIF funds, you're hosting targeted events, you're bringing more interest. So there's a slow burn that takes place in Jacksonville over a period of 25 years, and it's still ongoing, up about 25 years. And when you talk with them today, when you visit there, you can see the reversal of a lot of these many of the negative effects. And how do they do that? They opened up the streets, they created foot traffic. As you saw, they removed those buildings in the current square, and they encouraged investment. And so over time now, Jacksonville is seeing their downtown as an asset rather than a liability. And as you can see down here at the very bottom, their vacancy reduction. So in 2001, they had about a 27% vacancy rate in their downtown square. And today it's a little bit less than 5%. And I would argue that's a phenomenal story and one that can be replicated across the state with patience and intentionality, and with approaching people locally who either can invest in these buildings, as was the case in Jacksonville, or who have capacity to help figure out ways to bring investors in. So that is the story of Jacksonville. Next up is DuQuoin, and I highlighted DuQuoin because I was able to visit there last year. They have this really cool idea. I'll call it the New Roof Incentive Program. And it's a joint program by the city and DuQuoin Community Development Corp. DuQuoin does have a TIF district, and with the buildings that were in the district, they awarded up to 60% of the cost of the new roof. And then they also offered unsecured loans of up to 20% and with owner investment of 20%. So the way they did that is they took the average of what a roof replacement was a little over 18,000. And so they decided that the max TIP award would be 11,000 and max loan award would be 4,000. And then the owners covering the rest of the cost. So this is a great deal for owners, right? You have roofs that need to be replaced. And I don't have the monies to do that. Maybe I'm a bad owner, maybe I'm a good owner, but the city's taken a very proactive measure to buy 25 years for these unused resources or used resources and help business invest in other ways. So rather than have to worry about a roof, maybe I'm looking at my facade now, maybe I'm looking at new inventory, maybe I'm hiring a new employee. And one of the things I really like about their program is rather than focus on one building at a time or one thing, this program helped all of downtown just instead of just one project, right? So by creating a process where you have the ability for owners to replace their bad roofs, you're buying time. Potentially that owner is going to invest. Potentially they're like, maybe it's time to sell. Maybe somebody comes in and says, wow, this is a really cool building. And the city can say, yeah, we just had a new roof replacement on it, but we just helped facilitate new roof replacements. And again, roofs, windows, envelopes, extremely important. So if you're in a community that is not sure where to expend resources, expend your resources on building envelopes. And so they're maximizing their TIF funds by bidding for multiple jobs. So if I'm a building owner and I need a new roof, and there's a building owner down the street, now I'm seeking my own individual quote. Someone else is seeking their own individual quote. But by the city facilitating this, they were able to get quotes for all of the buildings at once, which drastically reduced the cost overall, which meant that their TIF dollars could be stretched a little bit further. So good on Quinn for that. Next up, we'll talk about Marion, population about 17,600. What you see here is a before and after picture. To the left is what this building looked like a little bit less than 10 years ago. And then to the right, you see what it looks like today. In talking with folks in Marion, this seemed to be the kickstart for a lot of what's been going on there over the past 5 or 6 years. And let me go through that a little bit. We'll call it reimagining Tower Square Plaza. The sentiment in Marion was that there's a downtown with this promise. Just what do we do? Right? The cultural and civic center was there, which means that you're going to have foot traffic, which means that you're going to meet people who are going to want to either go out to eat before or after something. You have people who may have interest in shopping before or after something at the civic center. And so now that's their hook. How do we leverage that? They also have a bunch of historic resources. So in Marion's case, luckily, a lot of their old buildings were not torn down. And so you have them there. They're in pretty decent shape, even not all of them. But they are definitely in a position where they can be redeveloped. And the benefit that Marion has is near highways, right? And so there are local folks who decided that private investment made a whole lot of sense. Local investors have purchased and intentionally redeveloped properties there. And I like the way that this was phrased. It's a no band-aids approach, right? Rather than get a building, throw a band-aid on it and just keep it around long enough, actually do the real work. Fix the masonry, fix the roofs, fix the windows. Do the things that are necessary to keep the building around for another 100 years, rather than keep it around just long enough to make a little bit of income. And the folks who are buying in Marion, they're building relationships with tenants and businesses. They're being very intentional in the way that they do this. They're being selective in who they bring in as businesses and tenants. The investors have business backgrounds themselves, so they're offering coaching to do businesses, explaining how financing can work even, and working with businesses, because those are the landlord. They want these businesses to be successful. One, because they're a building owner, and two, because they live in Marion, and so they're benefiting that way as well. And there's incubating going down there, right? So there's an opportunity to bring in businesses, allow people to have the opportunity to get their feet wet, see if it's going to work, and then once it does seem like, hey, this actually is going to work, then those incubated businesses go into a structure that might be available, just like this one, which was recently redeveloped, the Goodall building. And then so you also have in Marion good government. The government recognized the opportunity that was available, and they went through a whole series of planning. They asked the questions, they talked to the community, they figured out what a roadmap looked like, not just a hodgepodge approach to things. And they leveraged grants and other resources, to make all of those things happen and develop the plan to incentivize business owners. And they've pivoted to create a mural district. So now you're bringing artists in, you're bringing in art interest, you're creating vibrancy in your downtown. Again, these are all things each community can do if we take the time to do it. And I look at Marion as, this is my phrasing, a symbiotic catalysis of private sector actors and government. And what I mean by that is it's not just businesses doing something and government doing something. They're working off each other, so they're catalyzing each other in a very rapid pace. You know, the business owners are more, the building owners are more than landlords. They're almost like business development professionals. And the government is acting more than just, you know, interested in government core services. They're acting as a real planning agency to work with the building owners who are then working with the businesses. It's a very unique thing that they're doing there in a lot of ways. And they've had a lot of success in a very short period of time. Here's another building. This is the lavish bath box. To your left, you see the before pictures. In the middle, you see the during renovation pictures. And to the right, you see what all this looks like afterwards. Well, all this is going on in Marion to date. So kudos to them for the wonderful work that they're doing there. Next, I want to highlight Atlanta, Illinois. I wanted to highlight them because they've been very good at working with local co-creators. And so what is a co-creator? Co-creators are, I've referenced a lot of that already. You know, they're not necessarily government employees. They don't work for the city. They don't always have an official role. They can be artists, they could be business owners, they could be executive directors of nonprofits. These are folks who have an investment, who are invested in the community, maybe in different ways, that do have a role to play in the future of the city by way of planning and economic development. So Atlanta, it's on the original alignment of Route 66. It's halfway between Chicago and St. Louis. They had a lot of historic resources. They remained even after the 60s, 70s decline after 55 came in. So again, Atlanta is one of those places where a lot of what they had was not torn down. And so the co-creators created something called the Atlanta Betterment Fund organization in 2008. And that then led to Atlanta Economic Development Commission in 2014. And the three big things that they've done there is they worked with the city to purchase and develop 15 acres. They created a business development district. And they've leveraged TIP funds to develop 366 tourist attractions. That includes gaming things. So there's a lot of foot traffic and car traffic through Atlanta because they're using their hook of Route 66. And one of the cool things that they did is they formed a public-private partnership, you know, back in the late 2000s. And they focused in on the Palm Grill Cafe, which had this sort of iconic, you know, reputation in a lot of ways, especially in Route 66 lore. And you can see a picture of the Palm Grill Cafe to the right. And they applied for grants, they sought donations, they built capacity, and they did a $500,000 restoration of the cafe, which is actually owned by the library/museum, which is then leased out to an operator, right? So all the dollars are going back into their efforts of redeveloping through their public-private partnership. And when they went through that 2009, 2010, they saw a 43% increase in sales tax in Atlanta, which again, a lot of that was coming from tourists. So it's not that it's free money, but it's dollars coming in, flowing in that can then be reinvested into the community. And the last I have to talk about is Princeton, population a little over 7,000. What you see here is a before and after picture. These are currently acting as Airbnbs. See drastic changes to the facade there. So why Princeton? Princeton because they went through a very intentional planning and execution stage. They did community-based planning for their Main Street. In 2016, they did some research, they got community input. In 2017, they had a revitalization plan in place. By 2018, they had 2 National Registered Historic Districts, the North Main Street and the South Main Street. And then since that time, their redevelopment has been steady and consistent within both districts. And what we're seeing is boutique shops continue to open. We're seeing private investment from local residents. As people open up one shop, they're like, hey, wait, I want to invest in my downtown too. And there's a lot of resources available and historic resources available in Princeton for redevelopment. And they engage in structural and systemic enhancements. Chamber of Commerce initiated a building improvement grant. That's relatively new. The municipality hired the tourism director, so now tourism is growing, which equates to more sales tax revenue, which then gets thrown back into all their processes within City Hall, through the chamber, through their downtown plan. And I would argue that Princeton has done the proactive versus reactive approach. They saw the opportunity, they have all these resources, they know that they need to do something. And rather than just keep fighting bad owners or trying to figure out a hodgepodge way to get somebody there, they went through that entire community planning process and they ended up with this registered district. And now they have some right staff in the right positions, doing the job that they should be doing. I mentioned the tourism director, for example. They're showing an eagerness for new businesses. They're being very intentional. They're looking for businesses that make sense based around their codes, based around the variances that they have. Don't just say they want to open a business, let them open the business. Does it make sense for our overall plan for downtown? They have a revolving loan program, so they're encouraging the good owners to make the necessary repairs. And they're addressing bad owners. And talking with some folks there, they have not gone all the way to some of the ways that I've talked to, eminent domain. They have on occasion used a court order process, but they are doing violation notices. They are following up with the owners. They're involving attorneys as they need to. They are creating a track record. They are trying to incentivize good owners and they're trying to disincentivize bad owners concurrently. They're working towards right now revitalization options instead of demo options. So they're doing a little catch up and they're right there on the cusp where rather than getting a court order after a building's too far gone and then having a demo, unfortunately, they're looking at ways like how do we get to the building quicker through a court order? That way we have a chance to seek redevelopment options. And again, these are a couple pictures before and after. To your left in the top, this is before picture of an old store. And then the bottom and to the right, this is main architecture firm, Studio K's offices in Princeton. It's awesome space. I appreciate what they did there, and of course, I always appreciate their partnership. So I went through a whole lot in about 50 minutes. And with that, I would ask if there are any questions. Happy to answer questions. I know we have limited time, but I'm here and I can be here for as long as need be.
Thank you, Quinn. That was a lot of information and some really interesting vignettes on a number of communities across the state. I see we've got one question folks had submitted, and that relates to, let's see, where was it again? This was actually a question more about the artistic side. Comes from Jacob Rose with the City of Highland Historical Commission, asks, he's seen Landmarks Illinois do a love bombing on a building where you place hearts on a building. How difficult is that to organize? That sounds like a whimsical approach.
Happy to answer that. And Jacob, nice to hear from you again. It's been a couple of years. Still need to get down the Highland. So heart bombing, yes, heart bombing is something that our organization does through our Skyline Council, which is our young professional board. The idea is to, at least in our case, is we identify a structure each year to show it love, right? And it grabs a lot of media attention, but allows us to tell a story around the building. And so it's not necessarily difficult. It's just a matter of finding the right partners who are interested in doing it. It's more or less a crafts project where you take construction paper, crayons, markers, whatever, and you're sending love messages to the building. The most important part of a heart bomb, though, is bringing in community partners, the local residents who have an interest in seeing that place saved. And so our organization then works with them. We do the heart bomb, brings us media attention, and it's more like a feel-good thing. But it does show the community, especially if you have a government that's not interested in seeing a building saved. It shows the government and the community at large that there is indeed interest in this building. This building does, have significance, that it does have purpose and merit. So the heart bomb is actually a lot of fun, even though there is a lot of planning. And I'm happy, if you want to learn more about it, I'm happy to talk about the process that we use offline.
Thanks, Quinn. I'm going to take a moment and we're going to briefly launch a quick little poll, single question, and ask folks to react, provide their input for the session. Are there any other questions out there? Feel free to either drop it in the chat or join us in the discussion. Okay, we have come to the 1 o'clock hour. And I would one more time like to remind everybody, if you could, to take some time for our Community and Economic Development, or the University of Illinois Extension Strategic Planning Survey. The link was dropped into the chat. If you'd find some time, we'd greatly appreciate it. We love the input of stakeholders in this strategic planning process. We greatly appreciate that. So I think we have come to the end of our time together. On behalf of the University of Illinois Extension and on behalf of Rural Partners, I want to thank you, Quinn, for both of your informative presentations, both in part 1 and part 2. Very much appreciated your involvement. As I mentioned earlier, for our participants today, if you registered for the webinar, you'll receive the presentation materials and a link to the recording in a follow-up email. I know some of you have dropped your emails into the chat. We will include you on the mailing list for those materials. I'd also like to invite you to visit our website to register for future webinars. You can visit go.illinois.edu/LGE. For example, this Friday, June 16th at noontime, you can join us for an update on state and federal broadband maps and the Connect Illinois mapping review process. Next week, we've got another webinar coming up on Wednesday, June 21st. Similar in vein to today's, this will be another program with Rural Partners on the Illinois Main Street Initiative. Invite you very much to join us for that as well. And I believe the link to that presentation was also dropped into the chat earlier in the presentation. So remember also that you can use the same extension resource to find recordings of a host of our prior presentations on the wide variety of topics that we traditionally cover. So finally, thank you again all for attending today's webinar. Have a great day, and we hope to see you back for future presentations. Thank you.